Imagine waking up one morning and everything you worked for your entire life is just gone. Not stolen, not burned in a fire, not lost in a flood. Just gone. Your savings account empty. Your job vanished overnight. Your house taken from you by a bank that once smiled and shook your hand. The business you built for 20 years shuttered. And the worst part, the part that makes it feel like a nightmare you cannot escape, is that it happened to almost everyone around you at the exact same time. Millions of people across an entire nation in a matter of weeks and months. This is not fiction. This is not a story someone made up to frighten you. This happened right here, in the United States of America, in the most powerful, most optimistic, most energized country on the face of the earth at that moment in history. And it happened so fast, so completely, that most people never saw it coming. They were dancing one day, and standing in bread lines the next. October 1929, the United States of America. The land of second chances, the land of reinvention, the land where any man with ambition could make something of himself, crumbled from the inside out. The stock market did not just fall, it did not simply dip. It collapsed with the force of something that had been holding back enormous pressure for years. It shattered, and when it shattered, it dragged everything connected to it down into the wreckage. Factories closed their gates, banks locked their doors and turned away weeping depositors. Farmers watched their crops rot in the fields because no one in America could afford to buy them. Children went to school without breakfast. Grown men, veterans of war, heads of households, men who had built things and fixed things and worked their whole lives with their hands, wept openly in the streets. Families who had owned property for generations were evicted and moved into shacks made of cardboard and scrap tin. This is the story of the Great Depression, the most devastating economic catastrophe in American history. A crisis so total, so awe-consuming, so brutally indifferent to the dreams and plans and dignity of ordinary people that it rewrote the rules of how governments function. It changed what Americans believed about money, about safety, about responsibility, about each other. It carved a permanent scar across an entire generation, a wound so deep that their children, and their children's children, still carry traces of it today. But here is the question that haunts historians and economists even now, nearly 100 years later. Was this disaster truly an accident? Was it the result of bad timing, bad luck, a perfect storm of unfortunate events that no one could have predicted? Or was it the entirely predictable, almost inevitable result of an entire decade of recklessness, greed, and willful blindness by the people who held the power? And perhaps most chilling of all, could it happen again? Could the same pattern emerge in our own time, dressed in new clothes, carrying new names, hiding behind new technology? By the end of this story, you will understand not just what happened in 1929. You will understand why it happened, how it was allowed to happen, and who paid the price. And that answer, when you fully grasp it, is far more disturbing than the crash itself. The decade that preceded the Great Depression was unlike anything the modern world had witnessed before. The 1920s in America felt like a miracle. After the unspeakable horror and loss of World War I, a war that killed tens of millions, that poisoned fields and shattered cities across Europe, the United States emerged not destroyed, but transformed, energized, ready. While the nations of Europe struggled to rebuild from rubble, while old empires collapsed and new governments stumbled, America stood apart. The ocean had protected it. The war had enriched it. And now Americans were ready to exhale, to live, to chase every pleasure and possibility that peacetime offered. The economy roared to life with a ferocity that took even optimists by surprise. Steel production doubled. The automobile industry expanded at a pace that seemed almost magical. Henry Ford's assembly lines churned out cars faster and cheaper than anyone had thought possible, and suddenly the automobile, once a toy for the wealthy, was becoming a reality for working families. The number of registered cars in America went from 8 million in 1920 to 23 million by 1929. Roads were being built, bridges were going up, gas stations appeared on corners where nothing had stood before. The whole infrastructure of modern American life was being laid down in real time, and people could feel it, could see it happening around them every single day. New inventions transformed how people lived in their homes. The radio connected living rooms to the rest of the world in a way that had never been possible before. Families gathered around the set in the evening to hear music, news, comedy programs. A whole shared national culture delivered directly through the air. The refrigerator began replacing the icebox. Electric washing machines eased the labor that had consumed women's days. The telephone spread into more and more households. Every month brought something new, something that made life feel faster, more connected, more modern. But something was building beneath all of this brightness, something quiet, accumulating, hidden in the foundations of the very prosperity people were celebrating. The joy of the 1920s was real, but it was not fully earned. Much of what Americans were experiencing, the new cars, the new appliances, the new furniture, the constant sensation of having more, was built on credit. The concept of buying on installment plans, of paying a little now and a little more later, spread through American consumer culture like a wildfire through dry grass. Debt became normalized, debt became modern. Debt became the American way, and the more debt was normalized, the more risk was quietly accumulating in the system. But as long as people had jobs and wages were rising, the debt felt manageable. It felt fine. It felt like progress. What few people understood, what almost no one in the general public was thinking about, was how fragile the entire structure had become. The prosperity of the 1920s was like a magnificent building that looked solid from the outside, but had been built with rotting wood inside its walls. As long as no one pushed too hard, it would stand. The moment real pressure arrived, the whole thing would give way at once, and no part of 1920s America was more intoxicating, more dangerous, or more brilliantly deceptive than the stock market. The New York Stock Exchange had existed for over a century. For most of that time, it was understood to be a place for serious, professional, wealthy investors. It was not the domain of everyday working people. It was technical, complex, and risky, or so the conventional wisdom held. But in the 1920s, that understanding dissolved. Ordinary Americans began pouring into the stock market in numbers that had never been seen before. Teachers, factory workers, shop owners, secretaries, farmers who had a little extra cash, all of them were drawn by the same irresistible force. The market was going up, and it did not seem to be capable of stopping. The numbers were extraordinary. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which tracks the value of major American companies, roughly tripled between 1924 and 1929. Tripled. In 5 years, people who had invested modest amounts were watching their holdings grow at rates that no savings account, no bond, no other investment could come close to matching. Stories circulated in newspapers, in barbershops, at dinner tables of ordinary men who had become wealthy almost overnight by picking the right stocks. The market began to feel not like an investment vehicle with real risks, but like a guaranteed wealth machine. Like something you would be a fool to stay out of. And the financial industry was happy to help them in. Brokers opened offices across the country. Banks pushed investment products. A new industry of stock tipping, market prediction, and financial advice sprang up to serve the millions of new amateur investors hungry for guidance on what to buy next. But the most seductive and the most dangerous innovation of all was buying on margin. Margin buying worked like this. Instead of paying the full price of a stock, an investor could put down just 10% of the cost, sometimes even less, and borrow the remaining 90% from their broker. If the stock went up, the profit was calculated on the full value, so even a small rise produced enormous returns on the tiny amount you had actually paid. It was financial leverage at its most extreme. It made people feel like geniuses. It made even modest gains feel spectacular. What it hid, what it disguised behind layers of paper profit, was the catastrophic risk on the other side. If a stock purchased on margin dropped, even slightly, the broker would issue what was called a margin call, demanding immediate repayment of the loan. Investors who couldn't pay would have their stocks sold instantly at whatever price the market offered. And because so many people were using margin, when selling started, it triggered more selling, which triggered more margin calls, which triggered more selling. A self-feeding spiral of destruction, waiting patiently for the moment that confidence cracked. By late 1929, an estimated $300 million worth of stocks were being carried on margin in the American market. The system was a loaded gun pointed at the head of the entire economy, and no one in power pulled it away. At the center of this carnival stood men like Charles Mitchell, the powerful chief of National City Bank. Mitchell was the embodiment of 1920s financial ambition. Charming, loud in his confidence, visionary in his salesmanship. He believed in the markets with an almost religious fervor. He deployed armies of bank salesmen across the country to sell stocks and investment products to anyone who would listen. Customers who had come to the bank to deposit their wages found themselves being pitched on market opportunity. Mitchell organized campaigns that would sell securities the way corporations later learned to sell soft drinks, aggressively, persuasively, continuously. Mitchell was not alone. The entire culture of Wall Street in the late 1920s was oriented around sales, around expanding the market, around finding new pools of money to draw in. And if some of the products being sold were of dubious quality, if some of the securities were backed by very little of substance, well, the market was rising. So who was going to complain? There were also darker practices operating in the shadows. Groups of wealthy, connected investors would form what were called pools. A pool would quietly purchase large quantities of a particular stock, building up their position without attracting attention. Then they would begin generating buzz, planting stories in financial columns, spreading tips through brokerage networks, creating the impression that this particular stock was a brilliant opportunity. As ordinary investors rushed in, the price rose. At exactly the right moment, the pool sold everything, dumping their enormous holdings onto the market at the inflated price, walking away with massive profits and leaving regular investors holding shares that immediately began to collapse in value. This was manipulation, this was organized fraud, and it was almost entirely legal under the laws of 1929 because no regulatory framework existed to prevent it. The rules had not caught up with the greed. Herbert Hoover took office as President of the United States in March 1929, carried in on a wave of optimism. He was, by any measure, a remarkable man. An engineer by training, he had organized one of the largest humanitarian relief operations in history during World War I, feeding millions of starving Europeans. He was a self-made millionaire. He was considered perhaps the most competent administrator in the federal government. The stock market celebrated his election by rising even further. But Hoover, for all his intelligence and competence, did not act on the warnings that were beginning to appear around him. And the warnings were there. A handful of economists were publicly expressing concern about the valuations in the stock market. Some voices within the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, recognized that the speculation had gone dangerously far. Roger Babson, a prominent financial analyst, stood before an audience in September 1929 and predicted bluntly that a crash was coming and that when it arrived, factories would shut down, workers would lose their jobs, and the depression that followed would be severe. The crowd, including reporters, largely dismissed him. Because nobody wanted to hear it. The economy felt too good. The mood was too high. Telling Americans in 1929 that the party needed to stop was like walking into a packed stadium at the peak of the game and telling everyone to go home. The idea seemed absurd, dangerous even, pessimistic, un-American. But something had already started to shift. In September 1929, the market began to behave strangely. Small tremors. Some previously soaring stocks began to wobble. A dip here, a sudden unexplained drop there. Smart money, the large institutional investors who understood the system from the inside, began to quietly move toward the exits. Not loudly, not publicly. They didn't want to start a panic. They just knew. They had always known. And now they were done. And then came October. Thursday, October 24th, 1929. A date that would be burned into American history forever. The market opened and within minutes went into a free fall unlike anything traders had witnessed in living memory. Panic erupted across the floor of the New York Stock Exchange with a speed and force that paralyzed the men who stood there. Everyone was trying to sell. No one was willing to buy. The ticker tape machine, the technology that printed updated prices and broadcast them across the country, fell hours behind because the volume of transactions was so enormous, so unprecedented, that the mechanical system simply could not keep pace. Outside on Broad Street and Wall Street, crowds gathered. Word was spreading through the city like electricity through water. Something catastrophic was happening inside that building. Men in suits pressed together on the sidewalk, listening to fragments of information, trying to calculate their losses in real time on numbers that were already outdated by the time they heard them. By noon, a group of the most powerful bankers in America quietly convened in the offices of J.P. Morgan and Company. They pooled resources, tens of millions of dollars, and began deliberately purchasing stocks at above-market prices. The strategy was calculated. They wanted to signal to the market that powerful men still had confidence, that the floor was holding. The gambit worked, at least temporarily. The market stabilized through the afternoon. Newspaper headlines the next morning were cautiously reassured. Perhaps it had been a terrible morning, but not a disaster. It was a disaster. They just didn't know it yet. Tuesday, October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. The name alone sounds like grief. That morning, before the market even officially opened, sell orders had stacked up overnight in quantities that dwarfed anything from the week before. When trading began, the selling was instant, total, and merciless. The bankers who had propped up the market 4 days earlier were themselves running now. There was no rescue. There was no cavalry. The dam broke. The market fell 16% in a single day. 16%. Billions of dollars in value, wealth that people had counted on, planned around, built their futures upon, evaporated in hours. Men who had been millionaires on Saturday were bankrupt by Tuesday afternoon. Investors who had mortgaged their homes to buy stocks on margin received their margin calls and discovered in a single terrible phone call that they had lost not just their investments but their houses as well. The ticker tape ran so far behind that investors had no reliable sense of what their stocks were actually worth in real time. They only knew one thing with absolute certainty: it was bad, and it was getting worse by the minute. Eyewitnesses described the scene on the trading floor as something close to madness. Men shouting prices that no one would accept. The noise was so enormous it could be heard outside on the street. One account described traders physically holding each other, not fighting, but simply too stunned to stand alone. But here is the thing that most tellings of this story get wrong. The crash of October 1929, as devastating as it was, did not by itself create the Great Depression. The crash was the spark. What turned a financial crisis into a decade-long catastrophe was the chain reaction that followed. Because the crash destroyed trust, and trust, it turns out, is the invisible scaffolding that holds an economy together. Banks began to fail. quietly at first, then with gathering speed. Banks had lent money to investors, to businesses built on speculation, to companies whose values had now been revealed as fantasies. With those assets suddenly worth pennies on the dollar, many banks were technically insolvent. And when word spread, when ordinary depositors heard that banks were struggling, they did what any frightened rational person would do. They ran to the bank to get their money before it was gone. The bank runs of 1930 and 1931 were one of the most heartbreaking spectacles in American history. Lines of ordinary people, families, elderly couples, working men and women, stretching around city blocks, around corners, sometimes around entire neighborhoods. Each person in that line was terrified, silent, calculating whether they were going to be in time. Some were, many were not. Because when a bank runs out of cash and closes its doors, everyone who is still waiting outside simply loses everything they had deposited. All of it. Gone. With no federal deposit insurance existing at that time, there was no recovery, no compensation, no government backstop. You lost your savings, and that was the end of it. Between 1930 and 1933, nearly 10,000 American banks failed. 10,000. The number is almost impossible to absorb, and with every bank failure, more savings vanished, more businesses lost access to credit, more workers lost their jobs, and more families had nothing to fall back on. The unemployment numbers became grotesque. By 1932, 25% of all American workers, 1 in 4, had no job. In some industrial cities, the rate was closer to 50%. Communities that had been built around a single factory or industry simply ceased to function when that factory closed. The streets went quiet. Storefronts went dark. A whole American city could feel like a ghost town, while people still walked its sidewalks. The bread lines and soup kitchens became the defining images of the era. Block-long queues of men in worn coats, hats pulled low, faces hollowed by hunger and shame. Many of these men had been managers, engineers, tradesmen, professionals. They had done everything right by the rules they understood. They had worked hard, saved, provided for their families, and now they stood in a line waiting for a bowl of soup because there was simply nothing else, no other option. No other plan. Farmers, who had already suffered financial difficulty throughout the 1920s, even as the rest of the country prospered, now faced something close to apocalyptic collapse. The prices of agricultural products fell through the floor. Corn, wheat, cotton, crops that farmers had borrowed money to plant, now sold for prices so low that it sometimes cost more to harvest and ship them than the farmer would earn from the sale. Banks foreclosed on farms across the Midwest and South. Families who had worked the same land for 3 or 4 generations, whose grandparents had broken that soil, whose parents had passed it down, were evicted, forced off, told to leave everything behind. These families loaded their remaining possessions into aging trucks and cars and joined a slow westward migration toward California, where rumors circulated of farm work, of fruit to be picked, of something, anything, to sustain life. They became known as Okies, though they came from many states. John Steinbeck traveled among them and wrote what he saw. The grapes of wrath captured their dignity and their suffering with devastating precision. But even that novel, brilliant as it is, could not fully convey the raw scale of displacement. Hundreds of thousands of people moving across a country that often didn't want them, looking for work that often wasn't there. And in cities, on the edges of parks and along riverbanks, the homeless built their own communities out of whatever material they could find. These shantytowns, neighborhoods of cardboard shacks, salvaged lumber, scraps of tin, appeared in cities from New York to Los Angeles. They went by a name that captured the fury and the despair of the people who lived there. They were called Hoovervilles, named for the president who many Americans now held responsible for their suffering. Herbert Hoover, the brilliant man, the engineer, the humanitarian, he had become a figure of bitterness and contempt in the eyes of millions of Americans who felt abandoned by their government. Hoover was not a villain. History has been somewhat unfair to him in reducing him to a symbol of failure. He genuinely believed, based on the economic philosophy of his time, that the economy would correct itself if the government did not interfere too dramatically. He believed direct relief payments to individuals would undermine the American character, create dependency, and ultimately make the crisis worse. He arranged loans for banks and businesses. He signed some public works measures. He tried in ways consistent with his understanding of the government's proper role. But he tried the wrong things in the wrong way at the worst possible moment. And while he deliberated, while he remained committed to principles that the reality of the Depression had already rendered obsolete, people were starving. Children were going hungry. Families were sleeping in the open air. By the election of 1932, Hoover's presidency was finished. Not merely politically damaged, finished. The American people had made their judgment with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran against Hoover on a simple, direct promise. He called it a New Deal for the American people. He did not claim to have all the answers mapped out. He was refreshingly honest about the fact that this was an unprecedented crisis requiring experimentation, adaptation, and willingness to try things that had never been tried before. But he promised one thing above all else, that the government of the United States would act, that it would move with urgency, that it would treat the suffering of its citizens as an emergency requiring an emergency response. The country voted for him with a force that felt less like an election and more like a dam breaking. Roosevelt carried 42 of 48 states. The Electoral College was not even close. This was not a political victory. It was a repudiation. America was rejecting not just Herbert Hoover, but the philosophy that government should stand aside and wait while its people drowned. Roosevelt took office in March 1933. On his first full day in the presidency, he declared a national bank holiday. Every bank in America closed temporarily to stop the panic. That same evening, he sat before a radio microphone and spoke directly to the American people in a way that no president had ever quite managed before. His voice was calm and warm, almost like a friend sitting across your kitchen table rather than a head of state behind a massive desk. He explained what had happened, what he was doing about it, and why people could trust the system again when the banks reopened. Tens of millions of Americans listened, and something shifted. The panic slowed. Not because the underlying problems had been solved overnight, but because a leader had finally appeared who spoke the truth and then acted on it. In the psychology of a crisis, that matters enormously. Hope is not a luxury. It is a resource, and Roosevelt restored it at the exact moment when the country needed it most. In the 100 days that followed his inauguration, more major legislation passed through Congress than in most entire presidential terms. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed hundreds of thousands of young men in outdoor work, building trails, planting forests, preserving parkland, giving them wages, meals, and purpose. The Public Works Administration funded massive infrastructure projects: roads, bridges, dams, schools, post offices, hospitals. The Agricultural Adjustment Act supported farmers by raising crop prices. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity and economic development to one of the poorest regions in the country. The Securities Exchange Act created new rules for the stock market to prevent the manipulation and fraud that had helped inflate the bubble of the 1920s. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking and, perhaps most importantly, created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guaranteed individual bank deposits. Never again would an ordinary American lose their savings because a bank failed. That protection exists to this day. The New Deal did not end the Depression quickly. Recovery was slow, jagged, and incomplete throughout the 1930s. Unemployment remained painfully high for years. The economy did not fully recover until the enormous government spending of World War II finally ended the long nightmare. Economists still debate exactly which New Deal policies helped and which may have prolonged the crisis. History is rarely clean. But what the New Deal accomplished, beyond the direct relief it provided, was a fundamental transformation of the relationship between the American government and its citizens. Before 1929, the prevailing belief was that the market largely took care of itself, that individuals were responsible for their own outcomes, that government intervention in economic life was dangerous and un-American. After Roosevelt, a new understanding took hold, that the government had a responsibility to protect its citizens from economic catastrophe, that certain basic securities, protection of your savings, support if you lost your job, income when you could no longer work, were things the government owed the people. The social safety net that most Americans take for granted today was largely built in response to the Great Depression. It is the Depression's most enduring legacy. But there is a wound in this story that was never fully healed. Not in the 1930s, not in the decades since. The people who built the financial system that collapsed, the bankers who pushed margin lending to people who couldn't afford the risk, the operators who ran the market pools and manipulated prices, the executives who sold worthless securities to ordinary investors while pocketing vast commissions. Almost none of them faced meaningful legal consequences. Some were embarrassed. Some appeared before Senate committees and gave testimony that revealed exactly how the game had been played. The public was outraged. Reforms were passed, but the people themselves largely walked away. They kept their wealth, or enough of it, and continued their lives. The millions of ordinary Americans who lost their savings, their homes, their livelihoods, their years, they were not compensated. They simply absorbed the loss and tried to rebuild. That is the quiet injustice that sits at the center of the Great Depression story, and it is an injustice that has repeated in various forms in every major financial crisis since. The Great Depression lasted more than a decade. For the generation that lived through it, the children who ate half a meal and pretended they weren't hungry, the mothers who stretched a can of beans across 3 days, the fathers who walked miles every morning looking for work they knew probably wasn't there. It was not history. It was Tuesday. It was the weight they carried every single day, and it shaped them in ways that never entirely went away. That generation learned to fear debt. They kept cash in places no bank could reach, inside mattresses, inside walls, in coffee cans buried in the garden. They never threw food away. They fixed things rather than replacing them. They saved compulsively, hoarded quietly, distrusted prosperity with a wariness that seemed irrational to their children, who grew up in the post-war boom, but made perfect sense to anyone who had watched everything disappear once before. These habits passed down through families like genetic code. Children absorbed them without being taught. Grandchildren noticed them without fully understanding where they came from. The Depression also changed the world far beyond America's borders. In Germany, already devastated by the punishing terms of the post-World War I peace treaty, the economic collapse of the early 1930s pushed a desperate population further toward extremism. Rising unemployment, collapsing banks, and a government that seemed incapable of protecting its citizens created exactly the conditions in which a man like Adolf Hitler could seize power by offering simple, furious answers to complex catastrophes. The Great Depression did not cause World War II directly. The chain of causation is more tangled than that. But it created the desperation, the rage, and the political vacuum in which the worst instincts of human nature found room to flourish. The effects of 1929 did not stay in America. They reached across the ocean and helped set the world on fire. So what does all of this mean for us today? What is the real lesson that a century of hindsight allows us to extract from this catastrophe? The Great Depression of 1929 was not a random act of fate. It was not an unforeseeable natural disaster. It was the product of specific choices made by specific people operating within a system that rewarded recklessness and distributed the consequences of that recklessness downward onto the people who had the least ability to absorb it. Financial innovation outpaced regulation. Ordinary people were given access to complex instruments they didn't understand by salesmen who understood them perfectly and chose not to explain the risks clearly. Warning signs were present and visible to anyone willing to look, but looking threatened to interrupt profits, so the looking was discouraged. And when the system finally broke, the people who had engineered its fragility mostly walked away intact, while the people who had simply trusted the system paid everything. We have seen this pattern again. In 2008, housing prices rose to levels that basic arithmetic should have made obviously unsustainable. Mortgage lenders extended credit to borrowers who couldn't realistically repay, then sold those mortgages to banks that bundled them into securities and sold them to investors around the world as if they were safe. The financial engineering was more sophisticated than anything that existed in 1929. The language was different. The instruments were new, but the underlying dynamic of private gain being maximized while risk was quietly socialized onto people who never consented to carry it was exactly the same. We tell ourselves with some justification that we have better tools now. Deposit insurance, central bank intervention, unemployment benefits, a regulatory apparatus, however imperfect, that didn't exist in 1929. These things are real, they matter. They have likely prevented several crises from becoming catastrophes. But the deeper lesson of 1929 is not a technical lesson about banking regulation or monetary policy. It is a lesson about human nature, about how prosperity breeds complacency, about how the experience of good times makes it psychologically very difficult to imagine that the good times might end, about how systems attract people who are very good at extracting value from them, while the risks accumulate elsewhere, about how the people responsible for maintaining the stability of a system will always find reasons to believe, or claim to believe, that the danger signs are nothing to worry about, right up until the moment they are. Every generation learns this lesson fresh, because every generation has to. The people who remember the crisis fade. The reforms that followed it are slowly eroded. The warnings begin to seem alarmist and outdated. And the cycle, patient as time itself, begins again. The Great Depression scarred America, but it also, paradoxically, revealed something enduring about the American character. Not the mythological character of rugged individualism that Hoover had believed in. The idea that each person was entirely responsible for their own fate and should expect nothing from their neighbors or their government. But something richer and more human than that, the capacity to stand in a bread line with dignity, to give away food you could barely spare yourself to someone who had even less, to vote, even in the depths of despair, for something better rather than something destructive, to build, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, a new set of institutions that might protect people better next time. The men and women who lived through the Depression and came out the other side were not broken. They were different, quieter perhaps, harder in certain ways, less quick to trust, but they were still there. They rebuilt. They raised families. They contributed to a post-war prosperity that their children would enjoy and sometimes take for granted. They deserved better than they got from the system that failed them. Every single one of them deserved better. And the least we can do, the very least, is to remember them clearly, not as statistics, not as a data point in an economics textbook, but as people. People who had dreams and plans and loved their children and worried about their futures. People who did nothing wrong except trust that the world they lived in would keep its promises. The ticker tape stopped. The music stopped. The lights in the clubs dimmed, and in the silence that settled over a shattered nation, America had to decide what it really believed, whether prosperity was something that belonged to everyone or just to the fortunate and the powerful, whether a government's obligation to its citizens extended beyond soldiers and courthouses to something more personal, more urgent, more human than that. Those questions were not fully settled in the 1930s. In many ways, they are not fully settled now. That is why this story does not feel like ancient history. It feels like a warning, one that was written in suffering, in hunger, in the faces of children who went to bed not knowing if there would be anything to eat tomorrow. A warning that has been partially heeded and partially forgotten, and will be given again, in one form or another, to every generation that stops paying attention. The Great Depression is over, but the forces that created it never went away. They are patient. They do not announce themselves. They work slowly, quietly, right up until the moment they don't.